extraordinarily large company that it's making. It's number 1 and number 2 in the States getting together there. Are companies not then getting to the stage where firstly they could be damaging the consumer by doing this, and also egos in the boardroom just get too large?
Yeah, I mean, the scale of these recent announcements is truly astonishing. As to whether the consumer will benefit from this, I think certainly in America and Europe, the antitrust authorities will be looking very carefully at these deals. And there is an issue about whether being large to compete in a global economy means that you'll have local problems in certain economies where companies just get too large.
OK. Now, the sectors where we've seen it particularly happen are telecom sectors, banking sector and chemical sectors. Are those particularly exposed to the need to globalise, or are there other sectors that we think now will follow suit?
I think that there's a trend, that there's a view that these need to globalise, and I think in the sectors you've mentioned there's a lot of uncertainty about what will happen, and that uncertainty in itself is leading people to jump into the size issue rather than necessarily working out where the markets are going. Any
hope for the small guys, though? I mean, one sees them theoretically being squeezed out.
I think people have said that about the small guys for a long time. It started in cars in the 1920s. And again, if you go back to your report and ask who the big pharmaceutical companies are really worried about, the answer is the biotech companies, which are very small and often academic institutions.
Simon Gaisford, thanks very much indeed for joining us this morning. Look at mergers there. Well, time for an look at the markets. The bid-driven surge in London's equity market was halted on Friday by the market-shaking revelation that Barclays Bank chief executive was resigning and that the bank's full-year results would be well below forecasts. It ended a day of big moves in either direction at a net 16.3 ahead at 58.44. Wall Street pushed higher as the oil sector rose sharply after Exxon and Mobil confirmed their merger talks. It closed 18.8 points higher at 93.33. And in Tokyo, you can see the Nikkei's trading down a bit. Earlier I said that the investors more interested in bonds at the moment, it seems, than shares. And taking a look at the Hang Seng, we can see that that's down 232 points at 10,510. Let's take a look at how the currencies are performing. And the dollar currently trading against the yen, you can see at 123.78. That's up just about 3/4 of a yen there. The pound, meanwhile, against the dollar at 165.2 is off 2/5 of a cent, and against the Deutschmark, you can see it's off just about 1/3 of a pfennig at 282.6. That, of course, in the wake of comments from Wim Dousenberg, the ECB chief, saying, the European Central Bank chief, implying that there wouldn't be any short-term cut in European interest rates. Right, well, let's take a look at our share watch now, where we consider which stocks will be the movers and shakers on the London market. In a moment, I'll be talking to Peter Koenig of The Independent on Sunday. But first of all, let's take a closer look at Barclays Bank. A double blow, of course, on Friday with the surprise resignation of its chief executive, Martin Taylor, and the bank announcing that its full-year results would come in well below forecasts. Understandably, the news sent the share price tumbling. It closed down 114 at 13.74, bringing to a halt the recent share price recovery. That's just about 7%, by the way. In mid-July, Barclays peaked at £19.49, but then slid down to a low of £8.38 by early October. Since then, the shares had been making ground on the back of renewed interest in the equities market. But claims that a merger could now be on the cards for Barclays were dismissed by the bank yesterday. Major City shareholders, got to get that right, haven't I, will get the chance to question the bank's directors about Mr. Taylor's decision to quit at a series of meetings this week. So, Peter, tell me what the prospects are now for Barclays. Clearly, Taylor's rather sudden departure leaves the bank rather exposed.
Very exposed. There are two contradictory forces at work. You have pressure on the downside because there's no clear management there now in the long term. You also have questions about strategy. On the other hand, you do, despite what the bank says, has a lot of talk about the bank being in play. So it's a time for looking at share price movements intraday, and if you're not an expert, it's a time to be very careful.
OK, let's quickly touch on what the bank has lost. I mean, Mr. Taylor is perceived very much as an intellectual and has turned around the bank's profits pretty sharp, hasn't he?
He did an excellent job over 5 years in raising overall profits, but he failed to solve one big problem, and that is what to do with the big investment bank inside an even larger UK retail bank.
OK, but in the end it was sold off.
Well, part of it was sold off, but Barclays Capital remains, and that is a large operation, and they really don't know what to do with it.
Right. Is there one other possibility, and that's that Barclays Bank will be split further into Barclays Capital and the retail side?
Apparently, that was a proposal that Mr. Taylor put to the board, and the board decided it was a proposition too far.
OK. Barclays Bank is a pretty big chunk, isn't it, for anybody to swallow?
It is, although if you look at its capitalization of 20 billion now, it is swallowable by large global institutions. It could even be swallowable by Lloyd's TSB with a market capitalization of around 40 billion.
OK, but the words, the names at the moment are Pru and Halifax that are being talked about, aren't they?
Yeah.
Let's turn to Imperial Tobacco. It's reporting this morning, its finals. Now, of course, we've had that big lawsuit in the US. The tobacco companies there settled. So it's very much in the spotlight at the moment.
Imperial Tobacco is a good share right now. Its profits last year were about 307 million. They're expected to be up by as much as 10%. You have more clarity on the legal side. It's now the leading seller of cigarettes here in the UK. It's a good share.
And of course, it bought the what's the name of the company that sells those things that you roll your tobacco?
Cigarette.
Rizla, OK,
Right.
it bought that company as well.
Right.
So some papers there. Let's turn to Carlton. Now, that's also facing some start-up costs there in that case, if on digital, isn't it? So what do we expect there?
Well, the profits for the year are going to be slightly down, but I suspect that that news will be swamped by the fact of focus of interest on how On Digital is selling since its startup on November 15th. You also have a new chief executive announced last week, the 34-year-old wonderkin, Steve Kane. And you also have the...
Yeah, there's an interesting picture of him in one of the newspapers today, and he's been described as, you know, the chief executive sitting there with the little schoolboy cap,
Yes.
and Michael
Yes.
Green being the headmaster.
Yes, well, that's not a bad picture.
He's only 34 years old, I think, so that's pretty young,
right.
isn't it, to take over. We should also say that they got cold feet with their Arsenal deal, very briefly.
They backed out. However, they may be announcing on Tuesday the purchase for $200 million of Polygram Filmed Entertainment's back library, which would give them a big boost.
Brief comment on Bass profits warning we saw in September.
Bass, supposedly the price of the profits warning is built into the share now, and a lot of the city analysts are expecting the earnings to move up. I think that they have two problems. One is that their themed restaurants are looking weak and tired now, if not naff. And they also have a question over how well their hotel operation is going to do globally with the downturn.
Peter Kenny, thanks very much indeed for joining us. We can see there on the share price graphic that indeed the share price hasn't really recovered from that September down. OK, let's move on now. Some of the other day's stories. A reprieve may be on the cards for Siemens microchip plant in North Shields, which is currently earmarked for closure with the loss of over 1,000 jobs. According to a report in the Telegraph newspaper, an unnamed Chinese telecommunications group is in negotiations to buy a 49% stake in the factory, leaving Siemens with overall day-to-day control. The plant finished its last major order last week. 300 workers have already left. Government officials are drawing up plans to remove the regulation of company mergers from the hands of politicians. Trade and Industry Secretary Peter Mandelson is thought to favour depoliticising takeover policy, although the DTI is likely to retain final say over matters of defence or public interest. The proposals are due out next January. And as the Christmas season gets underway, confusion appears to reign on the high street. After several surveys indicating shoppers are feeling rather depressed, a poll by NOP suggests that we're expected to spend 20% more this year than last. The average bill for presents is, wait for it, expected to weigh in around £570. And a survey of the markups charged on different products has come up with the conclusion that one of the biggest rip-offs is the humble cup of coffee. A cup costs less than 10 pence to make, but sells on the high street for £1.20, while a cappuccino costs 20 pence and can sell for £1.50. Stay off the caffeine then. Let's take a look at what's happening in the newspapers this morning, and we're starting with The Guardian. It takes a look at the top dogs in the big business and asks, how much does personality matter? Have I got the right bit here? I think I've got the wrong bit of The Guardian, sorry about that. Oh well, never mind, you can see it as a graphic. When Barclays' Martin Taylor resigned on Friday, nearly £2 billion was wiped off the bank's valuation, but the paper says that the real difference made by individuals, for better for worse, is often grotesquely exaggerated. Markets, it claims, are made by men only up to a point. I did have the right article there. It says the boss talks. There you go. Not often knowingly undersold or wrong. Never mind. Anyway, Financial Times, where the Lex column gets to grips with the property stocks and why they've underperformed the market by about 30%. You can see it in the middle there. UK property. In the past year, the markets are pricing in a recession, it notes, but the industry, it says, looks well set to weather a minor downturn. Let's take a look at what The Independent has to say with Gavin Davis here. Are we repeating the errors of 1987 and 1988, asked Gavin Davis in The Independent, wondering basically whether central bankers have relaxed too much in response to a temporary market crash. No, he concludes, because global monetary policy has been too tight throughout this year and the recent easing has been overdue. He also refers to a 0.75% cut in the UK and also the US, and 0.4%, he says, from the European Central Bank. Surely some mistake, I thought. So rang up an economist and they said what he means is that Ireland, Spain, Italy, all these countries have cut, and if you weigh that out, that's 0.4% from Euroland. Well, let's take a look at the racing tip. We'll win with Tiger Shark at Lingfield, so hopefully today our luck will carry on with classical dance in the 12:55 at Kelso. And later in Business Breakfast. So farewell then to the system of open outcry trading, at least on London's futures and options exchange, where the future is most definitely digital. And how to navigate your way around the plethora of palm-top computers available this Christmas. We'll be weighing the pros and cons of different items later in the show. That's all after the news, weather and sport, wherever you are.